Good morning. Happy 4th of July. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray. Today is Popcast 63, and it's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 13. Um, we're going to talk more about the difficulty of change. Um, I have a point of view that is, I think, very helpful to being able to see how we could successfully proceed with change, um, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But I want to set the stage in talking about, some kinds of change, especially those affecting uh, larger communities beyond the family, at work, at your place of worship, at the community gatherings level, and the organizational government level. We're talking about changes to the system, systemic change. And it's really important to notice that we're essentially attempting to rebuild the stage that we're standing on. The system is part of what we stand on and live by. Once we create the system, we don't pay that much attention to it um, because we don't have to. In effect, is the stage or the envelope, think whatever, kind of metaphor you want. Um, but having created it, we then just use it without thinking about it. It's part of life. Um, we have to think about it from time to time when it starts to not work so well. But bear in mind that in our emotions, deep, the ones deep inside that are the hardest to deal with. Um, you're talking about, you know, uh, rebuilding the foundation of the house you're living in while you're still living in the house. You're talking about tearing up the boards on the stage while you're still walking around the stage, trying to conduct, the business of your life. So when you when you look at it that way, you can have a little more appreciation for how very difficult systemic changes are. And we know how hard change can be in the family. We've talked about that for a couple of days. But any group, the church, the job, the community, any group activity, there's a system involved, and changing the system is threatening emotionally, and not just a little bit. I've never lived through an earthquake in LA where a giant earthquake. We just had one little small one here in Maryland about, I don't know, 6, 7, 10 years ago. I don't remember exactly. That was pretty scary. I was at my son's house and the whole thing started to shake, and wow. But that was chump change compared to what other people have lived through. And I just can't imagine when the floor of the building you're standing on, 20 stories up, starts to shake, what it feels like. Well, that's what systemic change is. Um, and so the thing I'm going to propose that's important before I go on with more examples um, is an approach. It seems to me that the change itself has to begin by making it our problem instead of my problem or your problem. If it's somewhat like counseling, if you go into marriage counseling and say, well, she's the problem, it's already over. You're in serious trouble, dude. You might think about a divorce lawyer. Ugly stuff is coming. If you are invested in the marriage and the marriage is having difficulties, then you and your spouse have a problem. It's our problem. And when you and your spouse go see a counselor and say, our marriage has a problem, we have a problem, we'd like to make the marriage stronger and better. There's a lot of good stuff here, and there's some problem stuff. Help us make our marriage stronger and better. Now you're well on the path to success, my friend. Things are going to go, better. Uh, that attitude is critical. And if you're lucky and you come in with the wrong attitude, you're in the hands of somebody like Dick Hartzell, my dear friend and mentor, whose death I mourn every day. Um, who was the best listener in history, which was why he was such a really good clinical psychologist. And he would help you discover that you got to go back out the door and refix your attitude about whose problem it is. She's got a problem, he's got a problem, or we have a problem. And if you don't come back in with we, then don't bother coming back in. And he was really, really good at that. He was very successful. Um, so that's where we are. We're in the hands of Dick Hartzell if we're lucky. Um, we need to begin by the first step towards the other and hope and wait, hopefully, for this reciprocal step from the other. At that moment, the problems become not mine with you or yours with me, but ours with each other. And the key word in that is ours, our problems. Once we both recognize that the thing between us that's driving us nuts, the system arrangements that we really are not doing well with, once we see that it's our problem, that these arrangements are of our choosing for our benefit to facilitate our living together in large numbers, in close proximity, in this difficult dance that maintaining your balance in between all kinds of conflicts, that is the essence of the human condition. Once you see that it's our problem, then you've made a huge amount of progress. You can forget the divorce lawyer. You're just going to be spending more time working with the counselor and appreciating from the moment you see it's our problem that you're in a relationship that has every chance to thrive, and that there's issues in the relationship that are difficult, and that each of you has to maintain a balance, both personally inside yourself and between yourselves. And both balances are difficult and have to both be maintained at the same time. And then there's, all the change of events and circumstances that change the balance. So this country becomes a superpower. Well, there's a change in the balance of power. And the balance of power affects how all the countries dance with each other. This person becomes wealthy and famous. I married, a young woman who had a certain relationship to me and a relationship to the world. And now all of a sudden, her little grunge band is making $8 million a month selling YouTubes and whatever. I'm a little I'm a little clueless about grunge bands and how much money they make. But give me a break here. Work with me. you know, it's okay. So I don't usually tell jokes because they don't always work. But this one kind of calls for itself. There was a woman who perhaps wasn't the most gifted soul in the world, but she had a lot of troubles. And so she got on her knees and she begged God to please let her win the lottery because she was facing some significant financial challenges and including possibly losing her job, losing her house. And uh, losing her health insurance and just generally being up against the wall. And so a week went by and she didn't win the lottery. And most of you have heard this joke. I think it's been on the internet quite a bit. So after, another week of on her knees and begging God to help her win the lottery, no win the lottery. Third week, on her knees begging God to help her win the lottery, no win the lottery. And a voice comes out of a cloud and says, "Work with me, sweetheart. Buy a ticket." Okay, so I think it's kind of cute, but that's the way we are here. You know, um, we have to work with each other, and sometimes in the smallest uh, change of heart can have the biggest effect. So it turns out that the the change we might like to make in the system is enormously less important than the change we make in our relationship to each other. Once we see that problems with the system which is essentially just the social arrangements that we've made for how we'll live together, once we see that there's some kind of imbalance that requires an adjustment, and we all as a community, not just husband and wife, but most of the members of the community, people on both sides of the divide in sufficient number, can see that, oh, actually redoing our social arrangements, is a common problem. We all want to have arrangements that we're comfortable with. We all have a problem with change. Um, so we have this in common, and our social arrangements are ours. We made them, even though they may have been made by our ancestors 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago. But they're social arrangements that, in essence, we're in charge of for our lifespan. That's the way it is with life. Each generation, the people alive at any given moment, um, are responsible for the arrangements in their lives. And the arrangements constantly need to be tweaked because facts and circumstances constantly change. And until the big arrangements really don't work too well, we generally leave them alone and we deal at the edge with smaller arrangements. But right now, it's quite plain that our big arrangements are not working, not just not working well, they're not working at all. Our great divide is that huge. So it's time for systemic changes of the most fundamental nature. And that begins not with a proposal for changes. Um, we're going to, change these arrangements, change those arrangements. No, that begins with overtures to each other, whereby we recognize that this is our problem shared in common, that we collectively have to do things to the social arrangements we live by because the ones we're using now aren't working. Once we see that it's our problem, then we start working together to come up with possible ways to move forward, possible changes. And we do so with the honest recognition that it's going to be very difficult to reach agreement, that everybody has to maintain their individual balance while you're rebalancing the community. And it's pretty scary and it's pretty hard to come up with. Did you remember the old-fashioned scales at the doctor's office that maybe you still have one in your gym? You stand on this thing and there's a bar at the top, two of them actually, one for larger weights and then the small one for the individual fractions of pounds and pounds. And you have to slide that bar until the the metal rod that the bars are placed on achieves a balance in between the upper and lower limits. So here on the right, there's a metal clip, I guess you call it. It's got a top and a bottom, and this bar tends to go up and down like that. And when you get the weight just right, it balances in between, and then you've achieved whatever You've learned what your weight is. But that balance can be difficult. Now, supposing while you're trying to move the small, marker on the top for a quarter pound or a half pound to get the balance just right, some fool has got his hands on the big bar below and is moving that. Some fool. I'm see how easy it is to speak, in terms of other people that aren't helpful. The whole, you just can't go forward thinking like that, and yet we all think like that. If we're gonna see it as our problem, some fool cannot be the way we view people who are doing things we don't like. And unfortunately, it is the way we view people who are doing things we don't like. So we have a starting problem of our own personal attitude, and that's a part of this. So you make an overture, you hope it's met. When you both realize, when both sides begin to realize in large numbers, this is a community problem, this is our problem. It's a really hard problem, and we can't solve it, but we can address it. We can manage it by seeing that it's our problem and seeing that we're all trying to work towards making things better, towards finding a new balance, because obviously we're out of balance. So that is how you begin, and that's a key thing. There's no progress to be made by proposing changes. You remember there's some really sad examples of what happens when radical changes are proposed that aren't seen as our problem. So in the French Revolution, there were a number of people who had very radical ideas about social change, and they began by chopping a lot of heads off. Um, didn't work out too well for them. And I'm thinking of the famous artwork of one of the principles of the Reign of Terror, as those few years were called, being stabbed to death in his bathtub. I believe his name was Marat. But think of Pol Pot in modern times. He was a brilliant intellectual, apparently, who lived in Cambodia and wanted to have a total and dramatic change based on his intellectual perceptions of what was best for the community. His ideas for change were so startling. It's amazing he was able to put them into power, but he and his group succeeded in killing 30 million Cambodians in 10 or 15 years in their effort to make them better. We have to kill lots of people so that the remainder will have this ideal social arrangements that I have envisioned in my incredible intellect. Um, Essentially, that's what happened to communism. It started out as a guy recognizing how rough the everybody but the owners group was being treated by the owners group in the industrialized nations, England and other countries that were in the midst of dramatic industrial changes in the 1800s. And essentially, Marx's notion, intellectual notion, is very much a part of Christianity, from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. It's a fabulous intellectual idea. Um, in the hands of Lenin, it turned into, let's see how many people we can kill to consolidate our power. Um, I don't know how much blame we're going to give Marx for that, but certainly it turned pretty ugly. Um, and in Christianity, it didn't get past the first, relatively short space of time. I'm not scholar enough to know if it lasted 30 years or 50 or 150, but the idea that people would live in this kind of generous relation was tried to some degree, and apparently it was found that it's just too difficult. Um, our founding fathers decided that systems should be arranged in respect to, in regard to, in appreciation of human foibles and human weaknesses, so that it was better to create power groups that competed with each other for power because they would keep the other from becoming uh, overly powerful and potentially dangerous, as learned in the French Revolution and as Pol Pot showed can happen in Cambodia, and as Lenin and Stalin did in Russia to Marx's ideas. Um, so we uh, I've completely lost my train of thought, and it's already time to quit. Um, we're going to leave it there. We begin this very difficult process of change by making it our problem. That's a lot better way to approach it than by using an individual's intellect and imposing some intellectual solution, which often turns out to be a disaster, or imposing an overly loving solution that doesn't take into account human weakness. Um, so we come up with something that we begin by making it our problem, and then we work on our problem. But as soon as it becomes our problem, the great divide ends. The whole divide is you're the problem. And once it becomes our problem, the divide ends. And now we just have the practical difficulties of how in the heck do we do this balance uh, while we're dancing on the scale and somebody's fooling with a big heavyweight on the bottom. Uh, okay, so but that's a lot better off than where we are now. Okay, take care. Happy 4th of July. It's also my son in law Michael's birthday. He's a wonderful man. So I'm very, very pleased to have him as my son in law. And he's produced 3 of the finest grandsons anybody could ever desire. And he's brought them up to be wonderful young men, all quite different. It's a happy day. Okay, see you tomorrow. Bye bye.